please end this?" The rancher shook, then did the unthinkable. John Marshall had lived on the same ranch in Montana for as long as he could remember. The land was vast, stretching for miles with rolling hills, wide open fields, and a horizon that seemed endless. The ranch had been in his family for generations. His grandfather had cleared the first acres, and his father had taught him how to care for the animals, fix fences, and ride the land like it belonged to him. John always loved the quiet life of the ranch. There were no crowded streets, no loud noises, just the wind through the grass, the distant call of a hawk, and the gentle lowing of the cattle. It was peaceful, but it was also lonely. He woke every morning before sunrise. The smell of the cold morning air mixed with the faint scent of hay and the animals was comforting. He would stretch, put on his worn boots, and step outside. His breath would make clouds in the cold air, and he would take a deep moment to feel the world waking up around him. There was a rhythm to the work, feeding the cattle, checking the fences, mending broken tools, and making sure every animal was healthy. John found a strange kind of happiness in routine. The work was hard, but it kept his mind steady, and he liked the feeling of accomplishing something each day. Despite the calm, John carried a lot in his heart. Years ago, he had been married. His wife, Linda, had left after many arguments and disagreements about life on the ranch. She wanted a city life, with comfort, friends, and activities. John had wanted to stay, to work with the land that his family had cared for decades. He had loved her, but he had loved the ranch more. When she left, she took their children with her. Since then, John had only seen them a few times a year. He missed them deeply, but pride and stubbornness stopped him from reaching out more. Sometimes, when he was alone at night, he would imagine them running across the fields, laughing, and he would feel a deep ache in his chest. But the past was not the only weight he carried. Years ago, he had been involved in an accident that had changed him forever. A neighbor had been injured while working on the ranch, and John had always blamed himself. Even though it was not completely his fault, the guilt never left him. He remembered the day clearly, the sound of the rope snapping, the sharp cry, and the long, silent ambulance ride to the hospital. Since then, every mistake he made, no matter how small, seemed larger than life. He feared failing again, and it made him careful, maybe too careful. The memories were like shadows that followed him everywhere, even on the brightest days. Still, John found moments of comfort. In the mornings, he would watch the sun rise over the hills. The sky would turn soft pink, gold, and orange, and he felt a strange peace in knowing that the world continued, no matter what. He would often sit by the fence for a while, coffee in hand, looking at the cattle grazing. Each animal had a name, a small story, and he cared for them as if they were part of his family. He would talk to them sometimes, not expecting an answer, but just to hear the sound of his own voice. The land and animals gave him purpose. Without them, he would not know how to live. The ranch was not only a place of work, it was also a place of memory. Old barns, weathered and gray, told stories of his grandfather and father. The tools carefully hung on walls reminded him of long days of fixing, building, and caring. The old house, though small and simple, had a warmth that came from years of living, laughter, and hard work. Every corner of the ranch carried a memory, both happy and sad. And for John, the ranch was more than just land. It was a connection to his family, a connection to life, and a connection to himself. Yet life on the ranch was not easy. The winters in Montana were harsh. Snow would fall for days, sometimes burying the fences and making it hard for the cattle to find food. The winds would cut through layers of clothing and the cold would seep into bones. John had learned to survive. He would break ice in the water troughs, clear snow from paths, and make sure the animals were warm and fed. These days were the hardest, but also the most important. They reminded him that life required effort, patience, and resilience. John's neighbors were few, but important. The rural community was small, and everyone knew everyone else. Some days he would see a neighbor in the distance, waving from the fence line, and they would exchange a few words. Other days he might receive help with heavy work or a small gift of food or tools left quietly at his gate. These small acts of kindness meant more than words could express. They reminded John that even in isolation, people cared. Even when life felt heavy, these connections made the world brighter. Even with all this, loneliness was a constant companion. After long days of work, John would sit alone in his living room. The fire would crackle in the fireplace, casting a warm glow on the old photographs and simple furniture. He would think about the past, the friends he had lost, the family he rarely saw, the decisions he had made that could never be undone. Some nights he would talk to himself, wondering if he had done enough, if he had lived enough, if he had loved enough. And sometimes, in the darkest moments, he would feel a deep, quiet sadness, a feeling that life had moved forward without him. Despite the sadness, John tried to find small joys. He liked reading old letters from his father, listening to the radio for the latest news, or making small repairs that others might overlook. He would take long walks in the fields at sunset, watching the cattle move slowly across the grass. He would notice the small things: a wildflower growing near a fence post, a hawk circling overhead, the way the snow melted in patches to reveal green grass underneath. These small details reminded him that life, even when hard, was beautiful. John's life was a mix of peace, routine, struggle, and memory. He worked hard, but he also carried invisible burdens that never left him. Each day was a test of endurance, each task a reminder of responsibility. Yet through it all he had a quiet strength. He could face the harsh winters, the challenges of the ranch, and the weight of memory because he had learned to live with himself, with the land, and with the animals that depended on him. And so every morning John would rise with the sun, breathe in the cold air, and step into the world he knew so well. The ranch was more than work or property. It was his life, his identity, and his home. Even though loneliness and guilt sometimes clouded his heart, he could not imagine leaving. The land had given him everything: lessons, memories, and a reason to keep going. And even in quiet moments, when he felt the weight of the years and the mistakes he had made, he found a strange comfort in knowing that the land, the cattle, and the rhythm of ranch life were still there, steady and unchanging, like a reminder that life goes on no matter what. And so, John carried on. He fed the cattle, mended the fences, and worked the land with the same hands his father and grandfather had used. He watched the sun rise and set, listened to the wind, and felt the connection to a life that was both simple and complicated. In the quiet of the ranch, John was never truly alone. The memories, the animals, the land, and the small acts of kindness from others kept him moving forward, day after day. It was a life of routine, but it was also a life of meaning. And for John Marshall, that was enough, at least for now. Winter had always been a challenge on John Marshall's ranch, but this year was different. The snow came earlier than expected and fell heavier than he had ever seen. The wind blew with a bitter force, cutting through even the thickest jackets. John woke before dawn, as usual, and stepped outside. His breath formed clouds in the freezing air. The first thing he noticed was the stillness of the herd. Most of the cattle were huddled close together, trying to keep warm, but some of them had wandered too far. He felt a knot of worry in his stomach. The storm had been relentless for days. The snow covered the fences and paths, making it almost impossible to move around the ranch. John struggled to clear the snow, but the sheer amount made the task overwhelming. His old truck got stuck multiple times while bringing food to the cattle, and he had to push and dig in the cold just to free it. Even with all his effort, he could see that some animals were weak and struggling. He knew that each day without proper care could cost him part of the herd. John felt the weight of responsibility like never before. The ranch had survived storms before, but this one felt different. It was bigger, harsher, and it seemed determined to break him. As he moved from pen to pen, feeding and checking each animal, he could not help but think about how fragile life was. The work was exhausting, and yet he had no choice. The animals depended on him, and he depended on the routine to keep his mind focused. Without it, he would feel lost. On the third day of the storm, John received a letter from the local bank. It was short and formal, but the words hit him like a physical blow. The letter said that his request for extra credit had been denied. The damage from the storm had put the ranch in a precarious financial position, and the bank saw no way to help him recover. John sat down on the edge of his porch, the snow still falling around him, and felt a rare moment of despair. He had always been proud and self-reliant, but now he faced a challenge he could not solve alone. The days that followed were some of the hardest of John's life. The storm continued to rage, making it difficult to care for the cattle properly. Some of the older animals could not survive the harsh weather. John did everything he could, breaking ice in the water troughs, carrying hay through deep snow, and checking fences that had collapsed under the weight of snow. Each time he fixed one problem, another appeared. The physical exhaustion was intense, but the emotional strain was even worse. Every lost animal, every broken fence, and every failure felt like a personal defeat. As if that were not enough, one morning a neighbor came by with news that cut deep. The neighbor, a man John had known for years, accused him of negligence. He claimed that John should have anticipated the storm better and protected the herd more effectively. The neighbor suggested he might take legal action and even hinted that others in the small community might side with him. John's heart sank. He had always worked hard, done his best, and cared deeply for every animal. Now he felt attacked and misunderstood. The combination of exhaustion, financial pressure, and judgment from someone he had respected made the burden almost unbearable. At night, John sat alone by the fire, staring at the dancing flames. The cabin was warm, but it did little to soothe the turmoil in his mind. He thought about his children, about his lost family, and about all the things he had tried and failed to protect. His hands shook slightly as he held a cup of coffee, and he realized that he had not felt this level of hopelessness in a very long time. He tried to focus on the small signs of hope: a calf still standing, a fence he had managed to repair. But each tiny victory felt fragile, like it could be taken away at any moment. Then one evening, as he sorted through mail and bills, John found a letter from his daughter. She wrote simply and kindly, telling him she hoped he was safe, reminding him that she and her siblings loved him, and asking him to take care of himself. Her words struck a deep chord. For a moment he felt a warmth he had not felt in months, but at the same time, the letter reminded him of what he had lost and the distance between them. The thought that he might not be able to protect the ranch, or even himself, weighed heavily. The following day, the storm worsened. Snow piled higher against the barn, and the wind howled so loudly that John could barely hear himself think. He spent hours outside, moving from pen to pen, ensuring the cattle had enough to eat and water. Some of the younger calves struggled to walk through the deep snow, and he had to carry several to safety. Each time he returned to the barn, his clothes were soaked, and his hands were raw and red from the cold. But despite his effort, he could see the toll the storm had taken. Some fences were completely destroyed, and a few animals were already too weak to recover. By the fifth day, John's exhaustion was visible even to himself. He moved slowly, his mind foggy from lack of rest. Every task felt monumental, every problem insurmountable. For the first time in years, he felt a deep sense of doubt creeping in. Could he survive this? Could the ranch survive this? Could he survive another loss like the ones he had experienced? The questions circled in his mind, relentless and heavy, giving him little room to think clearly. That evening, as the wind battered the cabin walls and snow piled higher against the windows, John sat quietly in the dark, staring at the floor. His thoughts were chaotic. Memories of past failures, lost family, and the current struggle collided in his mind. The sense of isolation was complete. No one could fully understand what he was feeling. The ranch was his life, but it was also his responsibility. And right now, it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He whispered to himself, almost in disbelief, "Please, end this." The words startled him. They were a plea, a release of emotion, a signal that he felt he could no longer bear the weight of everything. Even in his darkest moments, a small part of him still held on. He thought about his daughter's letter again, the animals that still depended on him, and the land that had given him a purpose all his life. But the exhaustion, fear, and pressure made it hard to feel hope. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside him, a reminder that life could be cruel and unpredictable. He felt trapped between the life he had always loved and the overwhelming challenge of surviving it now. Over the next few days, the storm began to slow, and the first signs of melting snow appeared. The cattle that had survived started to move more freely, and the fences that had been destroyed showed signs of repair. But the damage had been severe. Many animals were lost, fences needed rebuilding, and the financial strain of replacing them weighed heavily. John moved carefully and methodically, trying to assess what needed to be done first. Every step reminded him of how close he had come to losing everything. Despite the challenges, John also began to notice small signs of help and support. A neighbor quietly brought over extra hay, leaving it at the gate without comment. Another called to check if he needed help with repairs. Even in his darkest moment, the community's quiet kindness reminded him that he was not completely alone. The support did not erase his struggles, but it showed him that others cared and that there might be a way forward, even if it was difficult. By the end of the week, John had managed to restore some order to the ranch. The cattle were fed, the fences partially repaired, and the worst of the storm behind him. But the emotional toll lingered. He knew the coming months would require hard work, careful planning, and patience. He had survived the storm, but the experience left him more aware than ever of the fragility of life on the ranch. Every loss, every struggle, and every act of perseverance had taught him a painful but important lesson: that survival required both strength and humility. And so, John Marshall faced the night once more, sitting by the fire reflecting on the storm and its impact. He was tired, but he was still standing. The ranch was battered, the herd smaller, and the future uncertain. Yet the experience reminded him that even in despair, small acts of effort, kindness, and care could make a difference. And though he whispered in desperation at the height of the storm, "Please, end this," He also learned that endurance, no matter how hard, could bring him closer to hope, even when it seemed impossible. After the storm had passed, John Marshall thought the hardest days were behind him. But he soon realized that surviving the storm was only the beginning. The challenges of life on the ranch returned in new and unexpected ways, testing not only his strength but also his spirit. Each morning, John rose before dawn, as he always did, but now he felt the weight of exhaustion more heavily. The snow had melted unevenly, leaving muddy paths and damaged land. The fences, though partially repaired, were weak and needed constant attention. Some of the cattle were injured or sick, and he spent hours tending to them, ensuring they had enough food and water. The financial strain from the storm continued to weigh on him. The bank had refused to extend credit, leaving John with limited resources to repair the ranch and care for his herd. He had enough hay to last a few weeks, but the cost of buying more, along with repairing fences and equipment, was beyond what he could manage alone. Each day he calculated carefully, wondering which tasks he could postpone and which could not. The stress was constant, gnawing at him, keeping him awake at night. Even when he finally fell asleep, the images of broken fences, struggling animals, and empty barns haunted him in his dreams. Loneliness pressed down on John like never before. He worked from sunrise to sunset, yet he spoke to almost no one. His neighbors were kind but busy with their own lives, and he rarely left the ranch. Some days he felt invisible, as if the world had forgotten him. Even with all the work he did, it never seemed enough. Every problem he solved was replaced by another. Every fence repaired was damaged again. The endless cycle made him question whether he could continue. The exhaustion was physical, but the despair was emotional, and it weighed more heavily than he cared to admit. One day, while checking the far end of the property, John noticed a calf lying in the mud, shivering and weak. He had to lift it carefully, feeling its small body trembling in his hands. He wrapped it in a blanket and carried it back to the barn, talking to it softly to calm it. The effort left him soaked in sweat, mud, and cold, but he refused to give up. The calf's survival depended on him, and for a moment, he felt both the heavy burden of responsibility and the unique reward of saving a life. It was a small victory, but it reminded him why he could not quit, no matter how hard life became. Even as he cared for the animals, John struggled with memories that haunted him daily. The accident from years ago, when his friend had been injured, was never far from his mind. Every mistake, every misstep now felt magnified. He worried constantly that his care might not be enough, that he might fail again. The guilt he carried was invisible, but it pressed on him like a weight he could never put down. Sometimes he would stop working, lean against a fence and close his eyes, wishing he could simply pause life for a while. The longing for relief was intense, but he knew he could not stop. The ranch demanded his attention, and the animals relied on his strength. In addition to the physical and emotional strain, John also felt the pressure of judgment from the community. His neighbors' accusations from the storm still lingered in his mind. He worried that others might think he was careless or weak. Though he knew he had done his best, the fear of being misunderstood or criticized haunted him. Each time he saw someone in town or even heard a distant conversation near the ranch, he wondered if they were talking about him, judging him. It made him more isolated, more cautious, and more determined to succeed, even when success seemed impossible. To manage the stress, John began keeping a journal. Each night he wrote about the day's work, the struggles he faced, and the small victories he achieved. Writing helped him process the emotions he could not say aloud. It was private, a conversation only he could have with himself. The words on the pages reminded him that he was still moving forward, even when it felt like the world was against him. Sometimes after writing, he would sit quietly, sipping coffee, listening to the wind outside, and slowly finding a small sense of calm. Despite the difficulties, there were moments of hope. The cough he had saved began to recover, growing stronger each day. Some fences, once repaired, held steady, giving him confidence that he could restore the ranch fully. A neighbor occasionally stopped by to help, offering tools or advice, and their quiet support reminded John that he was not completely alone. Even small acts of kindness gave him strength. They reminded him that life, though difficult, was still full of moments worth fighting for. But the struggle was far from over. John realized that the storm had not only damaged the physical ranch, but also weakened his sense of certainty. Every decision now carried higher stakes. Choosing which repairs to prioritize, how to manage limited food for the cattle, and how to plan for future storms became constant sources of anxiety. Each day felt like a test, and some days he failed. It frustrated him, made him feel inadequate, and intensified the weight of responsibility he carried. One particularly cold morning, John discovered that one of his favorite horses had injured its leg. He carefully cleaned the wound and wrapped it with bandages, but he knew the horse would need weeks of care. The thought of adding more work to his already endless schedule made him feel overwhelmed. Yet he refused to give up. He moved slowly but deliberately, setting up extra bedding, providing water and food, and monitoring the horse closely. The patience required was exhausting, but it reminded him that his efforts could make a difference even in small ways. As the days turned into weeks, John began noticing that his own health was affected. He was constantly tired, his muscles sore, and sometimes he felt dizzy from overwork and stress. Still, he pushed himself to continue. There was always another task, another problem to solve, and stopping was not an option. The weight of responsibility pressed on him relentlessly, yet it also reminded him of why he persisted. The ranch was his life, his purpose, and his identity. Even when exhausted and lonely, he could not abandon it. The mental struggle was as taxing as the physical work. John often replayed memories of his daughter and family, wondering if he had made the right choices in the past. He questioned his decisions, his abilities, and his future. Sometimes he felt despair creeping in, threatening to overwhelm him, but then he would see a small victory, a calf standing strong, a fence that held, or a letter from his daughter reminding him he was loved. These moments, though brief, became lifelines. They reminded him that even in hardship, life had meaning and value. John also began to reflect more deeply on his past mistakes and the lessons they offered. The accident from years ago, the loss of his marriage, and the challenges of running a ranch in such a harsh environment all carried lessons. They taught him resilience, patience, and humility. Though the guilt never fully disappeared, he began to understand that beating himself up for the past would not help him survive the present. Instead, he focused on what he could control: the care of the animals, the repair of the ranch, and the maintenance of hope. Slowly, John started to notice patterns in his days that gave him. He realized that he could divide tasks into manageable parts, that small, consistent effort could lead to progress, and that asking for help was not a sign of weakness. The challenges remained, but he found a way to approach them methodically, one step at a time. It did not remove the stress, but it gave him a strategy to continue moving forward. By the end of the month, the ranch was starting to recover. The cattle were stronger, the fences were more stable, and the land was beginning to heal from the storm's damage. John still faced enormous challenges, but he had survived the immediate crisis. His mind, however, remained restless. He knew that life could be unpredictable, that more storms could come, and that the weight of responsibility would never fully disappear. Yet he also realized that he was stronger than he had believed. The struggle had tested him, but it had also revealed his resilience. Even in his most exhausted moments, John found small reasons to continue. He noticed the sunrise over the hills, the quiet movements of the cattle, and the warmth of his fire at night. He received letters and occasional visits from his daughter, which reminded him of the connections he still had in the world. And though despair had whispered to him in the past, he began to understand that life, even when difficult, offered moments of hope, meaning, and purpose. Through the struggles, John Marshall began to understand the value of perseverance. He learned that life would not be easy, that challenges would come, and that sometimes the weight of responsibility felt unbearable. Yet, he also discovered that persistence, care, and small victories could make a difference. Even when faced with loss, fatigue, and isolation, he realized that hope was still possible, that even the hardest struggle could lead to growth, understanding, and resilience. Months had passed since the storm and John Marshall's near breaking point. The ranch, though still scarred, had begun to recover, and John himself was slowly finding a new rhythm in life. The snow had long melted, revealing the green grass beneath, and the fences that had been broken were now sturdier than ever. The cattle had grown stronger, the younger calves thriving under John's care. Even the oldest animals, who had barely survived the winter, showed signs of life and vitality. John felt a quiet pride in this recovery, though it was accompanied by the memory of what had almost been lost. Life on the ranch was never easy, and John knew that every day would bring new challenges. But he no longer felt the same weight of despair that had threatened to crush him months earlier. The storm had tested him in ways he had never imagined, and surviving it had changed him. He understood now that life was not about avoiding difficulties, but about facing them, one step at a time. Each small success, each act of care for the animals, was a victory in itself. And though the scars of hardship remained, John felt stronger for having endured them. One bright morning, John took a slow walk across the fields, watching the cattle graze in the sunlight. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the smell of grass and earth. He paused for a moment to take in the view, the hills stretching endlessly before him. The wind whispered through the trees, and he felt a calm he had not known in months. The ranch had survived, and so had he. In that moment, he realized that life could be harsh and unpredictable, but it could also be beautiful and full of quiet rewards. Letters and occasional phone calls from his daughter had brought warmth back into John's life. Though they had been distant for years, the experience of the storm and his near breaking point had reminded him of what truly mattered. Slowly, he had begun to reconnect with his children, speaking honestly about his struggles, his fears, and the lessons he had learned. They had listened, offering understanding and encouragement. The bond, once fragile and distant, was now growing stronger. John felt a deep sense of relief and gratitude. Family, he realized, was more than presence. It was connection, care, and forgiveness. The community around the ranch had also become a source of support. Neighbors who had once seemed distant now stopped more often, bringing small gifts or offering help with repairs. Their quiet gestures reminded John that he was not alone in the world, that even in isolation, people cared. These simple acts strengthened him and reminded him that life was not only about personal endurance, but also about shared humanity. Every smile, every handshake, every word of encouragement became a thread holding him to hope. John's work on the ranch continued, but it had changed in tone. Where once he had felt only pressure and responsibility, he now found purpose and satisfaction. He repaired fences with care, tended to the cattle with attention, and managed the land with patience. He even found moments of joy in small successes. A calf standing steady for the first time, a fence that withstood strong wind, or a barn door finally fixed. Each accomplishment reminded him that effort mattered and that perseverance could lead to progress, even in the most difficult circumstances. The memory of his breaking point, the night when he whispered, "Please, end this," never completely left him. But instead of fear or despair, it now served as a reminder of his resilience. He had faced the darkest moment of his life and had chosen to continue. That choice, made in the cold and quiet night, had saved not only the ranch but also his own sense of self. John realized that moments of crisis, while frightening, could reveal strength he had not known existed. The experience taught him to trust himself, to believe in his ability to endure, and to find courage in unexpected places. Even his health, which had suffered during the long struggle, began to improve. John slept better, felt stronger, and moved with more energy. He maintained the routine that had always been part of his life, but now it carried less burden and more meaning. Each morning he rose with the sun, not out of duty alone, but with a sense of purpose and connection to the land, the animals, and the people who cared for him. Work was still hard, but it was rewarding. The rhythm of ranch life had returned, tempered by wisdom and experience. John also began to take time to reflect and enjoy moments of peace. He would sit quietly on the porch, listening to the wind through the trees and the distant sounds of the cattle. He appreciated the simple beauty of a sunrise, the soft colors of the horizon, and the gentle movement of life on the ranch. These moments reminded him that life was not only about challenges and hardships, but also about the quiet joys that could be found in ordinary days. He had learned to notice them, to savor them, and to let them strengthen him. The relationships he had rebuilt, both with his family and his neighbors, grew stronger with time. His daughter visited more often, bringing her children to see the ranch. John shared stories of his own childhood, the history of the land, and the lessons he had learned. They listened eagerly, asking questions and laughing together. For John, these moments were precious. They reminded him that life could be full of connection, love, and meaning, even after years of distance and hardship. The ranch itself began to thrive in ways John had not expected. The land, which had seemed broken and lifeless after the storm, showed signs of renewal. Grass grew thicker and greener, streams flowed more steadily, and the fences that had once been damaged now stood firm. The cattle were healthy and growing strong. John's careful attention, combined with his renewed sense of hope, created a balance that had been missing during the long struggle. The ranch was not only surviving, it was thriving. John reflected often on what he had learned through the months of struggle. He realized that life would always have difficulties, that challenges were inevitable, and that the future was unpredictable. Yet he also understood that resilience, perseverance, and care could make a difference. Hardship did not have to destroy life. It could strengthen it, teaching lessons that could never be learned in comfort. He had discovered that even in the darkest moments, hope could survive, and that effort, no matter how small, could create meaningful change. Even as he worked and reflected, John remained humble. He knew that luck, community support, and the care of others had helped him as much as his own strength. He was grateful for the kindness of neighbors, the letters from his daughter, and the survival of his cattle. Gratitude became a part of his daily life, and it reminded him to keep perspective. Life was fragile, but it was also full of beauty, connection, and opportunities for growth. By the end of the year, John's life had changed in subtle but profound ways. The ranch was strong, his family relationships were mending, and his sense of purpose was clearer than ever. He knew challenges would come again, storms would return, and life would continue to test him. But he also knew that he had the strength, experience, and support to face them. The trials of the past months had shaped him into a man who could endure hardship, appreciate small victories, and find meaning in the rhythm of daily life. John Marshall now understood that life was a series of challenges and recoveries, each teaching lessons about perseverance, hope, and resilience. The storm had tested him, nearly breaking him, but he had survived and learned from the experience. He had discovered the value of patience, the importance of connection, and the strength of enduring hardship. Most importantly, he had learned that even when life seems unbearable, it is possible to rebuild, to find hope, and to continue moving forward. And so, every morning, John rose with the sun, fed the cattle, repaired fences, and walked the fields he loved so dearly. Each day was still full of work and responsibility, but now it was accompanied by hope, purpose, and the quiet joy of life restored.